All right, we'll start. It's Berkeley time now. Hello, everyone. Hello to you in the audience here and to our online audience as well. My name is Cristina Mora, and I'm a professor in the sociology department, and I'm also the co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies here at Cal. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our discussion on California and the 2024 elections. We are thrilled to have you here as we explore the evolving political landscape in our state and what it means for the upcoming elections. And I'm glad you're all here. I had to deal with 2 small kids and their sugar rushes after Halloween. So I know for many of us, it might have been a struggle to get out here. But it's important because California has long been a bellwether for national trends. And as we approach 2024, we're witnessing unprecedented changes in our electorate. Increasing diversity, organization, and issue engagement in the Golden State on the one hand sits alongside an increasing inequality, polarization, and government cynicism. And this all together sets the backdrop for an election that will not only shape the outcome of residents' lives, but also the direction of the nation. Today, we have assembled a distinguished panel of experts, each bringing unique insight into various aspects of this dynamic environment. From demographic shifts and voter engagement strategies to the impact of key issues such as criminal justice, economic policy, and women's rights, and what it means for California and the nation. And to my left specifically, we've got Mark DiCamillo, who's the director of the Berkeley IGS Poll. He's been actively involved in measuring public opinion in California since 1978, when he joined Field Research Corporation, founded by legendary pollster Mervyn Field. Mark is a recognized authority on polling in California and the author of hundreds of reports summarizing California public opinion. Next to him, we have Eric Schickler, who is the Jeffrey and Ashley McDermott Professor of Political Science here at Cal and the co-director of IGS. He is the author of numerous award-winning books on American politics. His most recent book, Partisan Nation: The Dangerous New Logic of American Politics in a Nationalized Era, is co-authored with Paul Pearson and was just released this fall. And congratulations, yeah. Next to him, we have Marissa Lagos, who is a correspondent for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk and co-hosts a daily show and podcast, Political Breakdown. At KQED, she also conducts reporting, analysis, and investigations into state, local, and national politics. She has worked at the SF Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the LA Times. Last, we have Laurel Rosenhall, who leads the Los Angeles Times coverage of California politics, supervising a team that includes journalists in Sacramento, LA, and DC. Based in the Sacramento Bureau, she manages coverage of the California Capitol and the state's congressional delegation. Before joining the Times, she covered state politics for Cal Matters and the Sacramento Bee. So welcome, everyone. Thank you. What we'll do first is we'll hear a presentation from Mark on the latest California poll results, and then we'll engage in a broader conversation where we'll welcome audience participation and Q&A. So go ahead, Mark, take it away. Has to go. Oh, there we go.
Great, and I think I want to share my screen with the audience that are in Zoom. We're all set. Great. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm sure that everybody here has had their fill of polls. I mean, I've been doing this all my life. I've never seen anything like this year. But I'm here to give you one more, the results of our latest pre-election poll here in California. So please bear with me. Okay, the first poll, sorry. How am I advancing this? Excuse me. I'm trusting this, it's not doing it. Thanks. Okay, if you're familiar with our IGS polls, this poll was done using a very similar methodology. We really don't change a lot. We mail out a large number of email invitations to random samples of the state's registered voters under the University of California letterhead. And in this particular poll, it was completed October 22nd through 29th. So we finished the poll exactly 1 week before Election Day. It was a large sample, and that's the benefit of using email. the method of email is that we can get very large numbers of people responding, which I think is a big advantage, especially when it comes to modeling or weighting the data, which I think is required now at just about every poll. We had 4,341 voters in our sample who were considered likely to vote or who had already voted. About a quarter of our sample had already voted at the time that we administered the survey. It was done in English and Spanish. And again, the sample was weighted to known demographic characteristics of the overall registered voter population. So we had about 5,000 registered voters in the sample before we got to our likely voters. That 5,000 or so would applied all of these weights on the known characteristics such as age, gender, ethnic group, region. I mean, we have a lot of variables that we try to ensure that our sample is corresponding to the characteristics of the state, and not only the state, but within 8 major regions of the state. We have so much sample to work with that we can actually apply weights at the regional level. Voters were defined as likely voters were defined as all of those who had already voted. They're the likeliest of likely voters. And in fact, we even matched their voting IDs to the registrar's offices across the state to make sure that they actually had already voted. So these are confirmed likely voters, plus those who answered on a 10-point scale that they're definitely likely to vote. And then we're also looking at their voting history as a factor in determining the likely voter sample. All right, so what is the shape of the turnout of this year's election? This is what our poll is showing that we expect the turnout to look like. The numbers are encouraging. Greater than 2/3 of just about every segment are actually intending or likely to vote in this election. That's a very broad turnout. Most elections are not that way, where you're only seeing certain segments voting with a majority. But here we're showing 2/3 or more. Certainly, we still see the same higher numbers among white voters, among homeowners, among those with higher levels of education, and among older voters. But still, I'm encouraged by the turnout. I think it looks like a good representative piece of the state's registered voter population. We also asked questions about how voters either had already voted or how they intended to vote. As you can see on the left, most of the voters either are voting now by mail or by dropping off a completed ballot at a drop box, or intend to just drop off their completed ballot at their voting site on election day, and many voters do that, but that's included in the drop-off. The people who vote in person is a real small proportion of the vote now. It's just 14%. I mean, I remember most of my career, that was the very large majority. As early as 2012, it was a majority of the votes were cast, by in person at their precincts. It's no longer the case. A lot of that has to do with the fact that all voters are sent their ballots directly by mail up to 4 weeks in advance. There are some differences, not huge, but some differences by partisanship on how people are voting. Republicans are still somewhat more likely than other segments to be voting in person. 22% of the Republicans are intending to do that, just 8% of the Democrats. And the Republicans are less likely to be using a mail ballot, although over a third now are doing that. And that's a change from last time around in 1980. Okay, now let's review some of the results that we got in our survey. The first has to do with voting preferences. And you can see that there really has been very little change in Californians' voter preferences in the presidential race over the 3 measures that we took since Harris became the Democratic nominee. In our final poll, she's getting 57% to Trump's 35%. Another 8% were either choosing other candidates that are listed on the California ballot, and that actually was 3%, and the undecideds were 5%, so that gave us the 8%. These numbers literally are identical to what we saw in late September, so no big shifts going on in the overall electorate. There are interesting nuggets, though, when you look at the results across by comparing the latest poll to what we saw in the exit polls in California in 2020. That's what we're showing on this graph. And at the top, you can see that Harris has this 22-point comfortable advantage, looks quite impressive, but it's certainly not as impressive as what Biden got in 2020 when he carried the state by 29 points. And if you look at the partisanship, she's doing less well among Republicans and less well among independent voters. Democrats are pretty much holding firm, but that's partly responsible for her getting somewhat lower levels than Biden did. But more significantly, in fact, are the drop-off in the percentage for the Democratic candidate among Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. In our latest poll, we're showing 57% of these voters choosing to vote for Harris, while a little more than a third are going for Trump. That represents a pretty big change from 2020, when 3/4 of the vote, according to the exit polls, were going to Biden among Latinos and Asian Americans. This is somewhat offset, however, by Harris doing somewhat better among white voters. And it's true among both non-college white and college grad white, although there's big differences in the preference margins of those two groups. And we saw that back in 2020. But she's doing better actually among both of those segments, even though she's trailing by a narrow margin to Biden among the non-college whites. She's overwhelmingly preferred among college whites, and that actually contributes to her doing better overall among whites. Other demographics on the presidential race, certainly there is a gender gap, but it's not as large in California as it is elsewhere. Female voters are about 10 points higher supporting Harris than male voters are. And I broke it down by married and unmarried because there are big differences there, where the unmarried females are 2/3 behind Harris. The married females are somewhat less. But you can look at the comparisons to the previous election, and even though Harris has this gender gap and she's very well received, she's still not doing as well among most of the segments that as Biden got in 2020, again, because he won by such a large margin. The segments on age, not a lot of differences across. At least the youngest segment and the oldest segment seem to be the strongest for Harris. But if you compare it to 2020, she's actually doing less well among younger voters than Biden did. And yes, less well among the middle-aged voters too, but she's hanging in there with about the same proportion of the seniors. Let's turn our attention now to the U.S. Senate race. Not a lot of surprises here. In fact, very little change over the entire course of the campaign. If there even was a campaign, very few voters really were exposed to many of the usual campaign ads that you would usually see in a Senate race. This was a very sleeper election. Adam Schiff was well ahead when we first polled, and this was the poll that was done where we paired the two right at the time of the primary election, and he's held that kind of lead throughout the entire campaign. In our final poll, he's receiving 55% to Garvey's 34%, 11% remain undecided, but this doesn't seem to have much change, and the outcome looks pretty convincing. If you look at the reasons why Schiff is supported, it's because pretty much party loyalties are dominating in this election. 86% of the Democrats are supporting Schiff, whereas 86% of the Republicans are supporting Garvey. But because Democrats outnumber Republicans almost 2-1, that's the natural advantage that Democrats have running statewide. No party preference voters. On Schiff's side, but a little less than the statewide average, which is not, great. But there's 18% undecided. They're just not paying attention to the race. You can see the differences by political ideology as well. It just follows along with partisanship. The liberals very much behind Schiff. The conservatives very much behind Garvey, but moderates, a swing voting bloc, are heavily for Schiff. We did measure 3 of the statewide ballot propositions and tracked them through the 3 polls that we did over the course of the general election. The first, and the one that got most attention, was Proposition 36. This is the proposition to increase sentences for repeat drug and theft offenders. It was supported early on in August by a greater than 2-to-1 margin, and it is not diminished. It's actually got to almost 3-to-1 in our September poll. It's now at 60% yes, 25% no, as the undecided has been going down. Certainly looks like it's well on its way to passage. When you look across segments of the voting population on Prop 36, even though the leadership of the California Democratic Party has actually been opposed to Prop 36, including the governor, you even see support, a plurality support among Democrats, 47 to 34. So they're not following the lead of their leadership, but it's got broad support among just about every other segment. The one segment that's lagging or that is actually opposed to the initiative are strongly liberal voters, but I could go show other demographic segments. It's ahead in just about every segment by age, by gender, by race and ethnicity. The only real segment that's behind is the strong liberals. The second one that we're looking at was Proposition 32. This was the initiative to increase the state's minimum wage. I think it would be going up to $18 for most people. It's 47% to 39%. You know, it's pretty flat over the course of the last month. Those numbers are not statistically different than what we got in late September. This one's real close to call. And because of the differences that you're going to see in the next slide, it really is going to boil down to the turnout as to whether the minimum wage will pass, because you're seeing very different preference margins. And I could show other graphs that show even more. The Democrats are very much supportive, 68 to 17, whereas the Republicans very much opposed. But swing voter bloc, no preference voters are slightly in favor, kind of reflecting the statewide average. There is a geographic split with urban voters much more inclined to be on the yes side. So that's where turnout is really going to matter. If LA County and San Francisco Bay Area turn out, this thing could pass, whereas it's not as popular in the more rural areas or in other parts of the state where our poll is showing it about even. In the Central Valley, however, it's on the no side, but there are areas where it's dead even, which would indicate to me that it may not achieve a majority in those regions. There are other differences again on this on the minimum wage, and as you might expect, voters who are lower income categories, renters, younger voters, more likely to be supportive. Voters who are better off, older voters, homeowners are more likely to be opposed. So it's a real tug of war on this, on social and economic class. And finally, the last graph, the last set of graphs have to do with Proposition 33. This is to expand local government authority to enact rent control. Actually, this initiative has been put before the voters 2 previous elections and has been rejected both times. Here you see the trend. Looks like it's going to go down again. At least that's what our final poll seems to indicate. It was running about even about a month ago, but now we're showing the no side increasing to 45%. So there's a swing to the no side. While it's not definitive, with a large proportion still undecided, usually those late breaking swings are indicative of how it's going to end up. The graph here just shows you the segments where opposition is greatest. You can see that homeowners are very much opposed, about 2-to-1. Republicans, of course, very much opposed. But the swing voter bloc, which is no preference voters, are on the no side. That's somewhat telling. White voters are on the no side, as are Asian and Pacific Islander voters, whereas Latino and Black voters are more likely to be supportive of this. So it'll be interesting to see how this breaks, but it looks like this one may be going down for a third time. So with that, I'll just take your questions afterwards, I guess. And thanks very much for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. And I guess we'll start with Eric. Eric, either thinking about Mark's results or the IGS poll results, or thinking more broadly, what do you anticipate are the top issues that we should be thinking about with California and the elections?
Uh, sure. Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Mark. And thanks everybody for being here. I mean, I think it's one way to think about what's going on in California is in what, to what extent is it a reflection of broader national phenomena, and speak to those, and to what extent is it different? It's obviously different from the nation as a whole and being much more tilted blue than most of the US, but we see some of the same factors that, are making national Democrats nervous at play in California. The results about Asian American and Latino voters being less strongly supportive of Harris than was the case in 2020 is certainly why states like Nevada, Arizona are, there's a lot. I guess I would say there's less optimism than maybe 4 years ago. The crime proposition, speaks to a change in national mood from 2020 to today, that where issues of crime have become a mobilizing issue for Republicans, and appears to be one of those issues that breaks through among, wider swath of voters. So the fact that California would be passing, this kind of proposal, assuming it does pass, just indicates it's a different political environment. I mean, obviously, Vice President Harris in her campaign is work. This helps make sense why Vice President Harris has framed herself as the prosecutor, and moved away from positions that, maybe she had in 2019 when she was running initially for president. So I think California gives hints about the broader national environment while also being, still a solidly blue state.
Yeah, great. Just a quick announcement. I know we have close to 80 people online, and so if you have any questions, feel free to post them on the Q&A. They'll be filtered through to me through my chat on the phone. So great. Marissa, any reactions?
I mean, I guess I have questions now for my dinner. I mean, I guess broadly, because I feel like, there's always polling errors in every election, and we don't know yet what those might be, right? With and this is because so much of what you guys do is an art as much as a science, right? Like, you have to make educated guesses about who the electorate will be. And we've just seen so many changes, to Eric's point, and almost reshuffling of alignments. I mean, I think both in how people vote, it's so fascinating to me to see, 20 years ago, you could always count on the first batch of votes on election night coming from more rural, more conservative places where they used mail-in ballots before, pre-Trump, pre the big lie, all of that stuff. It was a more conservative sort of chunk of the electorate. And then that shifted. And then now it's kind of feels like we don't really know what it's like, because I mean, even looking at how many, just only having a 10-point gap between Republicans and Democrats around using mail-in ballots, you would expect that to be bigger after the last 4 years. So that's really fascinating to me. And then, yeah, I just feel like we just don't fully know yet what this electorate, how they're kind of self-organizing. It does seem like the diploma divide is a bigger story than in years past, right? Educated, it used to be so much, we knew so much more around racial lines, and that seems to be shifting. So I'm just really fascinated to kind of see, and this is more on a national level in some ways with the presidential race, but how those sorts of things shake out. And yeah, I mean, I think it, and then my big question is do you guys feel like the no party preference chunk of the electorate has changed? Because some of your results make it seem to me like they're leaning more conservative than I feel like usually we've seen that kind of from a numbers perspective break, kind of commensurate to how the overall Republican Democratic registration, right? So if you have this chunk of independents and you have, 2/3 of the electorate are Republicans and or Democrats, and maybe it's 2/3 of the no party preference, but this seems different. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Sure. I think you're right, especially in the Senate race. I think Schiff, is perceived perhaps a little more to the liberal side than for some of the no party preference voters.
It's ironic because he was the moderate candidate, but whatever.
Well, whatever. But Yeah, I think that's becoming true. And, I think when you look at the party identification of those voters, that's where you see the change, because we also include in our polls party ID, and you can look at no party preference registrants by party ID. So that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
We did get a question online specifically on the undecided voters, so I'll ask it right here. Or the no party preference. Why do you think undecided vote on Prop 33 is so much higher right now, Mark, in this election cycle than in others than previous? What's your guess?
Well, I just think Prop 33 isn't just about rent control. It's also about a fight with the individual who put it on the ballot, who a lot of people in the Democratic Party dislike. So I think high information voters are probably reading op-eds and like thinking about this guy, Michael Weinstein, and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and, sort of pushback as to how he's used it. It's also tied to 34. I just feel like if that were like, I would guess the numbers would be different if this were like an up and down rent control question. And then also because I think there's been questions raised about what this would do to housing production beyond just like the debate over the economics of rent control. Like, would this impede the state's ability to force cities and counties to build more? I think for, again, like not all voters, but people who are really engaged and are reading that stuff are going to maybe have pause. So to me, I don't know if you have different thoughts, but I just think you can't disentangle this from Weinstein.
Oh, goodness. Sorry about that. For sure. He's a controversial figure. And like you said, someone who the establishment has, a lot of animosity for. But we, when we were looking at kind of which propositions that we wanted to poll, my thinking was that, that one and the minimum wage both kind of would both indicate something about concerns about cost of living, which obviously, you hear so much is that, people are unhappy about the economy, which really means they're unhappy about sort of their own household economy, not necessarily the bigger picture for the economy. But and I have found it interesting to see that kind of both of those seem to be going down to defeat
minimum wage, especially, is
right.
telling about, like, people seem to be connecting that with, well, that will make my cost rise.
Right. And so that was the thing that like I found interesting is that, you might think that like if people are concerned about getting by, that the idea of like raising wages and limiting rent increases would be appealing. But in fact, those seem to be going down. Now, maybe that's because they were effectively messaged and like campaigned on those cost anxieties, that like, oh, passing this rent control thing actually could lead to a reduction in affordable housing. And so maybe that, message is what resonated. And, on the minimum wage increase, there's actually been like much less in the way of campaigning than I expected. And so I don't know if it's that voters actually, are concerned that it will have the knock-on effect of cost increases. That's possible. But also the whole policy debate around minimum wage in California has been completely blown up in the last year or two by the actions that the legislature took to create a minimum wage for fast food workers and a different minimum wage for health care workers. And so I think that's blown up the politics. There's exactly, you don't have the same powerful interests all kind of coming together to push for all the one and the same thing.
I mean, I also just think broadly, like what we saw with Prop 1 earlier this year, with that bond, $6.4 billion for affordable housing and mental health treatment, and that, like, voters are just kind of pissed off, and they seem kind of like not down to give government more money or more power, I think, right now. And like, I would guess that's some of this too. Like,
but as we saw in the primary, we had Prop 1, which passed just barely, but in our final poll, it was showing 50%. And so that's kind of one of the things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at these ballot measures. Is it at 50% or more? The minimum wage is at 47. I think it's still got a chance. I wouldn't discount its probabilities totally. If it passes, I wouldn't be surprised. But again, I think it'll boil down to turnout. But what you guys are saying, these are kind of lower levels than you might have normally expected.
The other thing to consider is that the base for support for the minimum wage are in these urban centers that actually already have these high minimum wages. So I think to the
And that are really
coalition,
expensive.
yeah, I mean, for good reason, right? But this is going to have a bigger impact in like the Central Valley and places that don't already, that don't have higher minimum wages, but also where people are probably more susceptible to arguments about like maybe this drives up your costs, not just puts more money in your pocket. And then I think again back to Laura's original point, like there's not the same coalition maybe backing 33 that would have, or
32.
32,
Yeah. mhm.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just too many ballot
Yeah.
measures, you guys. So yeah, I don't know that they had like the ground game that they had in like the $15 fight a few
Right.
years ago.
Yes.
Do you think if it was disentangled from Weinstein, that would be seen a different, yeah.
I don't know that I think it's still something people are really skeptical of, and for good reason. There's a lot of like sort of cross currents around like the economics of what it actually does. I think it still would be a fight for proponents, but they might have had, again, a bigger coalition if you had liberal progressive Democrats going to bat for it. Like in this case, they've all run screaming because they don't want to be associated with them.
Eric, you were going to say something? Okay. It seems to me it's really interesting. It almost involves various different economic narratives about what's behind this and almost narrative fictions.
Say that about 36 too. I think.
Yeah. Let's talk about 36. Any thoughts on that, Laurel?
Well, we've also been polling in the district attorney's race in Los Angeles, and there, George Gascon, the district attorney, appears to be headed for defeat. And so together, and then also when you look at like what's going on in Oakland with the recall of the mayor and the Alameda County district attorney, and there does seem to be a very significant change in the electorate's attitudes about crime and the conditions on the streets of California. And so I think, if it was any one individual of those four things that I just mentioned, I might be like more cautious about drawing huge conclusions. But given that we're seeing all of that happen at the same time in the same election, and it's only been a couple years since voters totally turned down a very similar rollback of the Prop 47 criminal justice reforms. I don't even know do I need to explain more about that? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? I mean, Prop 36 is this tough on crime initiative that is seeking to revert some progressive changes that voters made 10 years ago in Proposition 47. And Marissa is the queen in California for her reporting on this issue. So I'm going to pass the mic to her. But the point is that a few years ago, only 2 years ago, I think, or 4 years ago, voters had the chance to repeal some parts of this progressive change we made a decade ago, and they shot it down. And now we appear to be on the cusp of passing it. So,
yeah, where to start on that? I mean, I will say, I think there are different dynamics in play in the candidate races than there are in 36, although there's crossover too. So I think Gascon, Pamela Price, and to some extent, I think you could throw the Sheng Tao recall in this. Like, I don't think any of them have done themselves any favors as politicians. I don't think they've done a good job being messengers for what they believe in. And so I think that's like a big part of this. I also was just talking on Political Breakdown today about like how funny it is to me that 2 years ago, 2 years ago, we recalled Chesa Boudin, the DA in San Francisco. Things have gotten better in San Francisco, but they haven't like magically overnight been fixed. The new DA has a challenger, but it's basically like a cakewalk for her. So to me, that just shows like we as voters often just like want to blame somebody. And like in that cycle, it was Chesa Boudin. For some reason, this time it seems more to be the mayor than the new DA. Like, so, I think like you have to consider those factors in the candidate races, especially. But I mean, with 36, I think there's been a lot of sort of conflating things with Prop 47, right? So a lot of, I think, what has driven public opinion are like these like viral videos about smash and grabs and these really horrific burglaries. Those are felonies. They are not Prop 47 events, but they kind of overlap with what we also see, which is you go to Walgreens and everything's locked up and you see somebody walking out like they can just take something without paying for it. And so I think all of that like drives a lot of frustration among people. And so I think it's not surprising. I also think like from an analyst perspective, if the governor and lawmakers have been willing to take up this type of organized retail and other kind of theft policies that they passed this year to try to head off 36, if they had done that a year or two ago, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. Like they failed to sort of see what was coming politically, and they were then unable to protect the policies that they liked because they just waited so long that nobody trusted them anymore. But the final thing I'll say here is like, for progressives who, you know, cheered Prop 47 and were very happy about the kind of turn away from the 90s policies, Prop 36 isn't that extreme. Like, this is not a return to, I think the DAs who wrote it would have written a very different ballot measure even 5 years ago. And so I think that that's like sort of something like, we talk about the pendulum swinging, but you have to consider like what's the center of the pendulum. And I actually think that that conversation has changed a lot, even though you see this backlash happening now.
You know, one thing I'd like to add just from the polling perspective, when we did our September poll, we actually had some follow-up questions that I thought illuminated what was kind of behind the strong support for 36. And it was really the repeat offenders part of this that they really couldn't countenance. They just think those people should be felons and that you should be putting them away. We had a more general question in the poll after we did the measure, which asked, which statement better describes your opinion of the most important aspect of the criminal justice system that needs improving moving forward? And it was an even split between those who said enforce stricter penalties on people who break the law. That's not repeat offenders, just people who break the law, and expanding rehabilitation and treatment for first-time offenders, or explore other kinds of options. The public is kind of in a divide on that right now, but it's the repeat offenders aspect that really, I think, is driving the vote on 36.
Can I ask you, PPIC has had wildly higher number, like they were in like 70%, which is pretty crazy. I feel like often your guys' polls are pretty close to one another. Do you feel like that, like the whole, like all of their polling has been significantly different than IGS this year?
Some of it. I've seen it on a couple of the other propositions too, and it's never reinforcing to me when I see that, because I give a lot of respect to PPIC over the years. Mark Baldessari has done a wonderful job, but you know, they've changed their methodology. I have to point that out. They've gone to kind of a panel approach. And I don't know, we'll wait and see. They had a higher level of support for Prop 36. They had a lower level of support for Prop 32. You know, I'm just sticking to my knitting here. We haven't changed our methods, and I'm, you know, saying that this poll is as good as I can make it. So let's wait and see.
Well, and that's why, like, nationally, as reporters, we all look at averages, right? Because you know that there's always going to be things y'all can control or different calculations you're making about the sample. But I just find that fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think what's going to be really interesting is kind of like what comes next. I think Prop 36 will easily pass, regardless of whether it's in the 50s or 60s, you know? And so I wrote a story today that just came out about like, are they making promises they can't keep? Because there's no money in this for drug treatment. There's no money in this for cops, which to me is like the kind of crux, like the fallacy of this is like, you have someone like the sheriff in Sacramento, Jim Cooper, being like, I can't get to every misdemeanor, make it a felony and I'll get there. And I'm like, you'll have the same number of officers and you won't know when somebody calls. I mean, in some cases you might have targets calling and saying, yeah, the same dude is stealing for the 15th time. But on average, you get a call as a cop, it's just a shoplifting call. So, you know, I think some of this has, as always, to do with much bigger pressures. We have a huge police staffing shortage in California, right? Like that is a problem that none of this will fix. We have a huge fentanyl crisis that is, you know, has international and, you know, global sort of things that are driving it. And there's no money in this for drug treatment. So like, yeah, I think how the Democrats in the legislature respond, how local agencies respond, and just like how the electorate responds in the coming years is going to be really interesting.
Just quickly on 36, do you think some of it was also the lack of a narrative of no on 36. Like
They kind of just like gave up before it started.
it almost felt like they came
yeah.
in towards the end, and there were some few key people, but it was hard to really just enunciate and elaborate why no on 36 in the face of all these viral videos, in the face of everybody knows what fentanyl does now, and the way they name it colloquially.
Yeah, I think that like that speaks to like bigger sort of political pressures on the governor, and I think also you've seen this really split the Democratic Party because the folks running are looking at the same number as you are, and they're like, do I want to have that fight? Like, it's not, why die on that hill? Newsom can because he's not running again right now, but for your average lawmaker, like even if they really do think this is bad policy, it's not really in their best interest to go out and campaign against it.
I mean, they have not done much of a campaign. What they have said repeatedly, the Democrats who oppose it, is we don't want to revert to, an era of mass incarceration. We don't want to go back to, filling up our jails and prisons with Black and brown Californians. And I think that like that is a message that's going to resonate with many voters. But then again, back to what Mark said about the repeat offenders, I think that for a lot of people, it's just kind of like, well, right. It's like, wait, the third time, like we're saying it's a misdemeanor the first time, it's a misdemeanor the second time. We're saying, and then on the third time, it's a felony, which still the judge will still have the discretion of whether or not to treat it as a felony. And like,
the DA will make most of that call.
Okay. The DA, but it's not, my point is that it's like, it's only on the third time that the punishment gets stiffer. And then on the third time, it's still not mandatory that it gets stiffer. It just has the possibility of getting stiffer.
So it is going to increase jail and prison population.
I know that,
for sure.
But I think that the idea, the vague notion of just sort of like mass incarceration might not appeal to people. But when you say we're going to incarcerate people who have been committing drug and theft offenses for the third time, that's like it's not as sympathetic.
We're all having to explain to our kids, like, why does that guy have like 16 packets of acetaminophen, stuffed in his pants,
and like walking out of Target,
on the 14th mission bus. I mean, the other thing is, though, I think what's ironic again about the miscalculation by Prop 47 supporters is if they had gotten ahead of this or even come to the table more, I think they probably could have avoided putting the drug use part in this, which I think was actually the main point of Prop 47. The theft thing was actually, I think, a second thought for the drafters. They thought we should not be locking up addicts. Like that was the kind of core of this, but it's all become part of this kind of broader narrative about homelessness, about fentanyl use, about, theft. And there is overlap. Like the DAs are right? People are stealing stuff in some cases to feed their habit. People are homeless in some cases because they're drug addicted. But I think that was a missed opportunity for folks who supported 47, was to kind of figure out a way to disentangle those things, because I think Laurel's 100% right. I also think people are not like super excited about locking up people who are just drug users, in California.
I mean, one way to think about it is, it speaks to a failure implementation of the legislature. California is so different from most of the U.S. In most of the U.S., things fail, and gridlock, partisanship, that's what caused it to fail. California Democrats have secure control of the legislature, governor's office. But when it comes to solving specific big problems where there are constituencies within the party that are not enthusiastic about change, think about how long it's taken for action on housing and how limited. It's just really hard. They're complicated coalitional politics that lead to a slowness in response that then leads to an outcome.
And when you pass something at the ballot, you can only change it at the ballot too, right?
In Sacramento, where Democrats have beyond a supermajority, they have 3/4 of the seats. So, to come in and convince them a few years ago that to go tough on crime, when the chairman of those committees are very much reformers who want to end an era of mass incarceration. Like they're truly committed to that vision of more treatment, less punishment, less less punishment for. And so that is not generally the way that the Democratic supermajority rolls. And we have seen that change this year. And yeah, they did pass this package, too late to head off the ballot measure, but they did pass this package of bills to address theft. But they passed some other changes to criminal justice policies that have failed for numerous times in the past, including, small things that, making rape of an unconscious person a felony. That had died in committee for like
Republicans have been trying to do that.
Republicans have tried forever, died in committee for like 5 or 6 years. This year it passed and Newsom signed it. And there were a couple other, things like that, which altogether shows that I think that the Democrats in Sacramento are getting the memo that they've been kind of behind the voters. And similarly in the House seats where that are very competitive in California, that are going to help determine control in Congress. Those are swing seats, and every single one of the Democrats running in those swing seats in California, they're all yes on 36. They're all like, totally fine to get tough on crime. So.
And I think you made a good point too about Kamala Harris running as a prosecutor this time. Like that, it just shows like the national narrative around this, and the idea that there's a calculation among Democrats that will not turn off progressives enough to cut into her base, but it can help her reach out to independents, maybe disaffected Republicans, and certainly more centrist Democrats. So yeah, we're in a very interesting moment.
And not that she needs to work to win California, but we did ask her, since she is a California voter, how she's going to vote on Prop 36, and she wouldn't answer. And we asked, multiple times. We asked her campaign, and then we had a reporter on the tarmac.
The people who wrote that literally worked in her DA's office. Like that, it is her people who wrote it.
Who wrote
47 originally.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. Latifah Simon, who's running for Congress, was part of that. Lenore Anderson. So that's so fascinating. Yeah, I know. We've been waiting. We're like, is she? Yeah. I don't think we're gonna hear from her.
Let's talk about these congressional races in the state. Which one should we be paying close attention to? Very specifically.
Yeah. So I'm not going to remember all the numbers off the top of my head, but there's the Duarte Adam Gray race in around Modesto. There's the Rudy Salas, David Valadeo race in the Central Valley. There is Mike Garcia, George Whitesides in northern LA County. And then there's 3 in Orange County. One is Katie Porter's seat. One is held right now by Michelle Steele and Calvert. Yeah. Sorry. There's one there's others on the margins, but the other big one is the Calvert Rollins race out in the Inland Empire, which I find so fascinating because there's like a huge, not just that race, Rollins is openly gay, but there's like a Democrat, transgender woman running for state assembly right down there who's looking pretty strong. Yeah. So you have this like weird, like, Senate, the mix of like Chad Bianco, like the MAGA sheriff down there, and then someone like Rollins really making this push, because there's a lot of people who have moved out to places like Palm Springs and others that are more liberal. But yeah, I would say, don't you feel like in all those races, I mean, there's minor differences depending on the district, but like, it's the same. This is how all politics is national. Like it's about the economy, it's about abortion, and to some extent it's about immigration, although I don't feel like that's been as like powerful here and potent as it is in other states.
I mean, there is one House race in San Diego County where immigration has been an issue. Yeah, it's held by a Democrat. It's one of the few in California that Democrats are defending, held by Mike Levin. And since even though it's northern San Diego, it's a border county, so obviously the border issues have been big there. But yeah, no, I mean, crime is an issue in a lot of these races, in the Orange County ones, and cost of living. And then, of course, Democrats are trying to make abortion an issue too. So, but yeah, I mean, it is a banner year for California in terms of like having relevance nationally in determining control of Congress. And,
they're all good, like on both sides of the aisle. I think everyone has pretty good candidates in these races. So it's interesting because, like the one in the Mike Garcia seat in northern LA County, Christy Smith ran against him three times and lost. Like, I think she was just seen as not a very strong candidate. You have someone like Whitesides who comes from like NASA and this aerospace background and has been able to self-finance. So yeah, it'll be interesting. What's interesting to me will be to see if those all break one way too, like regardless of the, like, because so much of this feels national, and yet you go to these districts and you still see why someone like Michelle Steele, who is very conservative, is like just such a good retail campaigner. Like people really connect with her. And so I think, yeah. And then also some of the demographic stuff we talked about. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think the demographic stuff is going to make a difference? So we're looking at much more voter engagement across different segments, the youth population, the Latino population, Black population. Like we're predicted to see much more engagement than we've ever seen before. How do you think this will affect some of these races?
I mean, I think in the Central Valley, yeah, we'll see. I mean, how many times have we had this conversation about the Latino vote? Come on, guys. I think in the
but it's coming.
Yeah,
it's coming.
I think in Orange County, it's really fascinating because you're seeing, I mean, both a shift in like who the population is to some extent, but like, like Michelle Steele's district, super high Vietnamese population, very high just Asian population in general, and well, very mixed too, like pretty high Latino, a decent amount of white voters. And I think the like generational splits are really interesting there. First generation folks, like, right, these are races that for years Republicans could really use like red baiting and talk about like communism and sort of play on a lot of the fears of folks who would escape communist regimes. Well, their kids are not like, that is not necessarily the thing that is speaking to them. So I think that'll be really interesting to kind of see like the difference in generational demographic splits and that sort of thing.
And I want to point out, Christina, when you added questions in our August poll, you had generational questions, which I added to our current poll.
Oh, fantastic.
So you can actually see the third generation Latinos are quite different than first and second generation. I mean, it's clearly there in the data.
When I think about Latinos, I tend now to think about generation, but much more increasingly, I'm thinking much more about the education split there. I see that is really sort of popping out in this election right now, because if you look at like a middle-class Latino population, there's a good amount that are middle class without college education. So they've gotten there through maybe construction, maybe sort of these trades, ways in which they've built on a family, sort of that. That population looks quite different than many of our undergrads that are leaving here and going to go be teachers or things like that. And I think this is where you might be seeing, I don't know, this is my own theory. This is where you might be seeing some of the trends that we're looking at. I'm not sure if the Asian population behaves the same way, but I'd posit that you'd get some of the exact same thing. So look,
right? If you're born here or your parents were born here, your grandparents immigrated, like you've had, I mean, this is what Mike Madrid talks about a lot, right? With the Latino population, it's like you see yourself as American first because you are in a lot of ways, right? And so like that's going to make you behave and think about, things differently. I also think it'll be fascinating, to see like the gender divide within those subgroups. And
you also have these conditions in which trends across Latin America are making it so that people aren't necessarily going back and bringing their families back and connecting those sort of connections across the generations. I mean, look, violence in Mexico has increased dramatically in places of central Mexico where you have most of the Latino population, most of the Mexican population here from places like Sinaloa, Michoacan, things like that. These aren't places where you can now be like, I've taken my grandkids back to see their place, their heritage place, right? So you're losing a lot of that. Like I used to spend most every summer going back to my parents' hometown, most every summer. I can't anymore. There's curfews, there's all these things, and I much less can I take my kids, right? So you have that element as well. And so their understanding of what Latinidad is, and I'm sure, you have some elements of this in the Asian population as well, not necessarily violence, but just sort of economic difficulties, or it's not as easy to continue to create that link. So you have kids that need an alternative way of identifying in all of this. And so I think you're seeing the education split there for sure. Yeah. What about polarization, Eric? What are sort of national trends that we are thinking specifically about California here?
Well, certainly, going back to the House races in the state, one way to think about, why there are 5 Republican held seats that are quite vulnerable this time, basically all rated as toss-ups. Why did those 5 Republicans win in 2022? Well, California voters, Democrats didn't show up, had a relatively low turnout year in 2022, in part because Californians felt shielded from some of the main mobilizing issues that election. In particular, the Dobbs decision mobilized a lot of Democratic voters across the country. Not as much in California because it didn't seem like as much of a threat. So I think a big question for in 2024, Democrats' hopes to win those seats back or win those seats really hinges on getting California voters to turn out due to fear of what Donald Trump in particular represents as a threat to them, even living in California. So I do think this pattern of, while each race has its own distinctive dynamics, there's going to be, or there could be, a tide, if Democrats show up, certainly the Harris replacing Biden turn the sense of those 5 races from, probably Republican favored with Biden at the top of the ticket and Democrats dispirited to basically toss-ups right now. And so that's, and that does go back to the point. Control of the House, I think Laurel made, is going to, is very likely to hinge on California, very likely to take several days to determine.
Well, we'll be lucky if it's several days.
A week, yeah. And so, I think California is, oddly both part of the national polarization story and yet also its own distinctive thing because it is so Democratic.
And as the Cook political report is, I thought this was a great statistic that I pulled out of their stuff. They said in 2020, the vote for the House and the vote for president, if you looked at the vote in their district, there are only 15 districts out of the 435 that voted differently. That is, if you voted for Trump, the Republican nearly always won. And I'm looking at that here in California too. I think the strongest areas for Trump in California are the San Joaquin Valley, and that's that Baldeo
Right.
district. So, he may get through again. If you look at the statistics, you can break the odds, 15 out of 35 to 435.
And he has like managed to routinely get elected when reelected when many Democrats thought they would be able to flip that seat. So he's managed to sort of keep himself like close enough to Trump to be considered a Republican and far enough away to like still maintain appeal in a district that has a lot of registered Democrats.
Do you guys feel like Republicans in California have become more conservatives in the Trump era or identifying as more?
So the state party is certainly staying,
Some of the numbers up that you guys went over, I can't remember exactly which ones, but it just like piqued my interest about that.
As to whether seeing some movement?
Just like if there used to be more, maybe even in policy areas, like, more of a moderate vein, and the right would shift under Trump has kind of trickled down on all that.
Yeah. I think that, I think over a long period of time, there's been this erosion of Republican moderates, arguably first at the elected official stage and then increasingly at the voter stage. And so, I do think, as one way to think about Trump is just crystallizing what the party reputation is. And so those former Republicans who think of themselves as kind of moderate, I think over time, have moved away from the party and either go into no party preference or, more rarely, I think, Democratic. That could also explain why no party preference voters maybe are a little bit less liberal to the extent that they've pulled in some former, Republicans, those who are not on board for the Trump agenda, but are also, not a liberal Democrat.
Right. On the other hand, we hear so much nationally about like younger men and younger men of color specifically leaning towards Trump and this kind of like manosphere, like the Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, like, which is, and so, but when you talk to folks like Sarah Longwell, who does a lot of focus groups, she's like, these are not socially conservative voters. Like they're anti-woke, but they're probably pro-choice or they're, so it's like, again, I just feel like there's a lot of realignment happening that like we don't fully understand yet.
I have thoughts.
Well, most women do.
Well, I just think of these young male voters of color and young male, and the way they're thinking about what woke is and what is politics and what should be politics and what should be personal. So they might be pro-choice, but they have a strong sense of, the transgender issue and the transgender and sports issue.
All the Trump ads right now.
Yeah, what is it?
Like transgender inmates. And
Kamala's for they, I am for you. Yeah.
Kamala's for they, them.
Yeah.
Trump is for you. Yeah.
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 One thing I want to add, there was a question earlier about no party preference voters, whether they're becoming more, conservative or Republican. I'm looking at the party ID follow-up. If you look at no party preference voters, it look very much like they always have.
Like overall,
50% are saying they identify more with Democrats, just 22% more with Republicans. So I don't see a big shift there. And if you look at the Republicans, how strongly they feel, it doesn't seem like a lot of them are saying I'm a strong Republican. I mean, it's
but
about
that could have to do with Trump too, because it's like really his party, not the
right,
GOP.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's this differentiation between whether it's Trump or the GOP. Yeah.
Well, didn't one of your early slides show that Kamala Harris among women voters in California was actually getting less support than Biden got 4 years ago?
Right. It was because Biden won by such a big margin. So, but you're right. With lower margins to 22 points, it's going to be coming down among women. Women are over half the voters.
That one just surprised me. I don't know. I feel like it's like, I know we don't know where it's going to end up, but this obviously, you have one candidate as a woman, but then there's been like so many gender issues that have played out throughout this campaign between IVF and abortion, and then the super machismo thing that Trump is doing.
He is skeptical of a woman's ability to lead as men as
Right.
well.
But I also think if you go back to 2020, Trump was the president. There was a huge reaction against Trump in California that I think influenced voters of all sorts, that kind of overrepresented the vote for Biden. It wasn't Joe Biden that was pulling him over. It was the revulsion to Trump. And somehow Trump has rehabilitated his image. It's just an amazing thing in the polling world.
Into it.
It's amazing. He's a campaigner extraordinaire. It's just
Also,
incredible.
like I do think that there's a very small segment, but there are folks, both men and women, who are, even if they don't sort of articulate it, like, but there is still some people who are like, oh, a woman like in the White House, is that? And I just, I think that Trump has this sort of machismo that people see as strength, and in an uncertain time. But I am really fascinated to see like how that actually breaks, and where the small sliver, but the undecided folks will be the ones who decide this election.
Isn't the top issue that they focus on is the economy? So the sense that because inflation has, if you pick an average, voter off the street, they're going to be talking about inflation and the impact of inflation and how everything's gone up, and we need somebody that's good for the economy. And somehow that's been tagged to Trump now.
She's really closed that gap.
Yeah,
though.
she has. Yeah. She has, but it's still tagged that way. And the other way they say it is like 4 years ago, we were better off economically, right? A pre-pandemic economy.
It's also just like they're both such like definitive people, and I do think in some ways Joe Biden was like generic white guy, like generic white politician, right? He represented so much, and like they both do represent a totally different era in politics, and so like I wonder, if there's some people who, we're happy, especially during the upheaval of COVID, to have a generic white dude.
If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Yes. And then I also have a question from the online audience.
Versus Biden, and Trump remaining essentially the same, those other votes must have gone somewhere. And it wasn't clear from what you showed in your charts where those votes went. Was there a larger group of third-party candidates, or was it undecideds, or was it maybe better third-party candidates? What is the reason?
The 2020 vote that I showed are the final results actually, and actually the exit polls are weighted to the final results. So there are no undecideds. So when you see Biden at like 65% or whatever, that's removing all the undecideds. Harris is at 57. She's going to get some of the undecided. She might get to 60. But it still looks like she's not going to reach the margin there. And, there's very few voters in our poll that are going for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or even Jill Stein. I mean, it's 1%, 1%. I mean, I can't measure that. The margin of error is greater than the number. So it's very tiny. And there was a point at which Kennedy was polling in double digits, but that was back when Biden was running. So.
But is this a larger slate of third-party candidates this year versus 2020?
It depends on what state you're looking at. Actually, Jill Stein is on the ballot in all 7 swing states, which to me is significant because that poses a threat to a very close vote. And if Harris should lose, you could point to Jill Stein's presence on a 1 or 2% level. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is only on the ballot in 2 of the swing states. And he tried to get off of the Michigan ballot. The Supreme Court wouldn't let him. So he's going to have less of an effect. So I think the Jill Stein effect is what has the biggest impact on who's going to be the president because she's there on all the swing states.
Yeah. We have a question from Linda online. Do you feel that there's a strong anti-incumbent sense in the California electorate that is affecting both down ballot races and the initiative?
I don't actually, because if you look at like how close these House races are, if you look at, I mean, so many of the legislative races really seem to be playing out on local issues. I think at a certain point, like the trends are national, but candidates matter. And like how people interact with them certainly matters. Like, I mean, the San Francisco mayor's race, I mean, maybe is an example of like anti-incumbent bias, but a lot of people I think have come home to breed. And in that race, what like polling shows me is money talks, right? Like you have Daniel Lurie running a sort of like he has sort of endless amounts of money for a local, in context of a local race. And it looks to be a contest between those two. So he is running as an outsider. And so I do think in individual races, that's a thing, but I don't feel like that's like overlying all the congressional races.
Yeah, I feel like the congressional races are much more, about, I mean, partisanship is so big there. And then the hints of anti-incumbency in the Bay Area are not partisan, right? Like San Francisco, if London Breed loses her office, it's just going to be another Democrat. And, if the Oakland mayor loses her office, like there's going to be another election, it's going to be a Democrat elected. So like it's, whereas in those House races, I mean, yeah, those people know their congressmen and like they know them as a person, but those are highly super, super partisan. And in Southern California, they are getting blasted with ads. Like we don't sense it up here, but they are, I mean, all of the national super PACs are, dumping into into TV and digital and everything. So they're really getting a lot of very partisan messages in those races.
Right. A question?
Yes, I have a methodological question. I was wondering, I didn't know what percentage of the people you emailed responded and agreed to participate in your poll. My sense is that generally the responders are becoming a more and more unique group.
No question.
And a smaller group. Can you model your way out of that? And also, what are methodological innovations to address, I think, just a growing problem?
Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, all polls, including ours, have very low single-digit response rates. No question. We can't defend our poll on those grounds. I think size matters in this particular issue because the modeling we can do is a fairly robust model where, we can look at voters who have less than a high school education, which a national poll can't really do very well. They don't get many of them, but we get over, a couple hundred of them, and we can apply a weight to those people to bring them up into the sample because they're not responding. And people who respond to polls, this is very clear in our polls, and we try to account for this as well. is people that follow politics. You get a way over reportage of people who voted in prior elections in our samples. And so you have to literally bring up the proportion of people who haven't voted in prior elections to their natural proportions. So we're trying to attend to it. You really need large samples to do that. And it becomes a real problem for smaller, even 1,000. I'm used to 1,000 sample in my whole career, but that may not be doing it now for the weights because of these really low response rates. And it's a problem. And I mean, the national polls and the others are trying to use multiple methods of outreaching to people. If they can't reach them by, telephone, they'll try texting, they'll try other methods. I mean, even red people are trying door to door, but that takes too long. You won't get the results in time. Mail is coming back too. I mean, everybody's trying different methods. I mean, when I first got here 7 years ago, I did polls in 3 different methods just to see what the results were, to see if I could get transitioning to email as an acceptable alternative because of the advantages of sample size. And I was convinced that that's the way to go. And I think the track record has been pretty good for us so far. We'll see. I mean, I'm always open to learning more. And, we did undercount Trump in the last 2 elections, and we're accounting for Trump now, as are many polls, by bringing him up to his actual proportion of the vote when we ask people, how did you vote in 2020? I know there's drawbacks to that, but it does bring up the Trump voters. So we've got so many different weighting factors going in. I'm glad we have the Berkeley supercomputers doing this for us, because I would never be able to do this at field. I'll tell you that.
I mean, so one of the issues with the national polls and a lot of the state level polls with respect to the weighting is that they are able to weight to the overall outcome, right? Which generally involves pulling up Republican votes because Democrats tend to be higher propensity responders. If they do that without like interacting a bunch of things with race, for example, that often, like some of the polls that have shown those they're moving away from this, but Latinos 50-50 in this race, massive erosion nationally is, I think, likely due to the way they're doing the weighting. And so you see these drastically different numbers among the Latino vote. They're kind of hurting now on this. So we're seeing less of this, but that we were seeing earlier, I actually think is probably an artifact of the way they were doing the weighting. One of the things we're able to do because of the sample size is a lot of interaction. So quite literally, we have a target for non-college age non-white voter, we have, and so we're not, which is something we noticed a few years ago, because when we weren't doing that, we were, running into some issues. And just one of the things, like the herding going on in the national polls now is really a concern there. I mean, there's just no way, given random sampling plus weighting, that you would get 7 tie and +1 minus. I mean, that's just not. And our weight, like our targets, we construct them well in advance of the election. We apply them. We don't do anything to change them, mess with them.
I just think that because like Harris has made this big play for like disaffected Republicans and people like that. Like, do you think those folks would be then answering these polls on the same? Like, could that? I don't know.
I don't know, but one other thing, I always take hints from what the internal polls are they're showing nationally, or that the campaigns are showing. Why is Donald Trump in New Mexico? He's seeing that the Latino vote is up for grabs. Why did he go to Charcello? I mean, he is seeing that there is, in his own polling, has to be, and I'm.
Donald Trump.
No. And I honestly think our sample of Latinos is over 1,000. I mean, we have a lot of them. We do it in English and Spanish. The national polls aren't doing it that way, and we're seeing a decline. And anyways.
Yeah, but we see a decline, but we also see a 22-point margin or whatever for Latinos. So that's, I mean, for Harris, so it's a decline relative to the baseline. It's hard to know, like, do we see, I think we see some erosion in other states and maybe more in Nevada, Arizona,
And
potentially.
California Latinos are drastically different from Miami Latinos, Texas Latinos, New Mexico Latinos
But are they different from Arizona Latinos?
They could be. Yeah, in some ways. Mainly because the larger political environment is different. And so in the sort of who's canvassing, who's outreaching to them, who's getting them out. I mean, I would bet so.
When I went out to Phoenix to cover Harris, I went and spoke with a bunch of California canvassers, and they were like, nobody's bringing up immigration. And I was like, really?
Wait, where?
In Phoenix.
In Phoenix.
Like, people want to talk about abortion, they want to talk about the economy. And I just found that so surprising. Like, that's not to say it's not going to drive votes, but like, and maybe if you were closer to the border, it would be a different situation. But I thought that would be like the first thing out of a lot of, their mouths. Who knows?
Why did they think not?
I think just like what is actually impacting people's day-to-day lives. And I think that there's, the economy is huge. And then I think the abortion question is really front of mind there because they have a measure on the ballot. And, they could basically go to a full ban. Like it's not theoretical there.
Yeah. And consistently, we've always seen Latinos say that immigration is not the top thing on their mind. I mean, the economy, education, other things have long
Back
been.
to like second generations are like, they're Americans. They're not,
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Alan?
I went to a talk he did recently, and I'm curious to bring in the question of the shy voter, and whether that's something you see or think can be applied here in any of the responses in California, or is that really something in the rest of the country where the race for president is much closer?
Well, the shy voter, I'm thinking of in two different ways. One is some shy voters just shy away from doing polls, and that needs to be accounted for. And that's what we tried to do by bringing up the Trump vote, because the last two elections, even though the Democrat carried California the way, it wasn't a big story, we underrepresented Trump, and that troubles me. I want to get those numbers right. So that's part of it. We're trying to account for the shy voter who's not participating. The other part of shy voting is a person who's participating in the poll who actually chooses not to offer their opinion, instead goes into undecided. And, this goes all the way back to the Tom Bradley Duke Majan race, where when we untangled all of our pre-election polls back in 1980, and, we had Tom Bradley winning by 5 points, but he lost by 1, we saw that a large portion of the undecideds in our poll were Democrats, 9 out of 10. So what does that say? They were shy about saying, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat. So they didn't lie to us. They actually just shied away. And that, I don't know, is that a part of polling? It's possible. I've always felt that particular election gave me an eye opener to look at the party registration of undecideds, but I didn't see anything in our polls. So.
The last question we'll take from online. It's from Greg. Biden uses the word garbage and it's national news, whereas Trump calls Harris supporters garbage all the time, with no mention of this in the press. Does polling reveal why Trump is immune from any repercussions from behavior that would destroy anyone else's candidacy? The worse he acts, the higher he seems to poll. What is the immunity he has with the electorate? Any thoughts?
You could get rich if you have an answer to this. I mean, he's Teflon. There's not like a logical explanation. I think it's sort of like a base thing that he apparently touches in some people. I don't know, like people just don't seem to care. And yeah, it's wild as a member of the media, honestly, to cover.
It does create a self-reinforcing dynamic in the sense that the press sees Trump do something and they know, well, when we cover, there's been so much else. If we cover everything, and
cover, I mean, it is, yeah.
But I mean, if you think about at least aspect, if you think about the proportion of attention, say that the New York Times and Post give to something that Trump says, I think it would be higher if the reporters and the people there believed that this, has impact. But the fact that there's just been so much, and if you report everything and none of it seems to make a difference, I mean, it just seems psychological that it becomes this kind of self-reinforcing dynamic. Nothing matters. Therefore, nothing,
to
you
talk
know.
about it.
well,
I would actually flip that and say, why did we focus so much on Joe Biden? He's not the candidate. Like, and the reason he's not the candidate is in part because of gaps like that and like showing his age. So like, I think like I do have some criticism of our colleagues for that. I think obviously that was something the Trump campaign really wanted to lean in on. I also question like the wisdom of dressing up like the garbage man when you're trying to kill a story about calling Puerto Rico garbage. Like it's just
started at Madison Square Garden at
It's
Trump's
just
event.
so
where
weird.
his-
Yeah.
Like where
Yeah.
it's his guest comedian who made the
right.
joke
So,
that
like,
started
why
the
are
whole
you trying
thing.
to bring
So-
that? Yeah. I
and
just
which
yeah.
in rebuttal to the question asker, I will just say like that. I mean, the
That got a
media
ton of coverage.
that got a ton of coverage, which is what started that whole little
Yeah.
news cycle, the garbage news cycle. But yeah, I mean, the core of the question from the question asker is, I think, like there isn't an answer to that question right now. And it is like the question of this era, of the Trump era. I mean, did anyone think that we'd be back at this time where he's like, might be president again? I mean, isn't that why the Senate didn't impeach him? Because they thought the criminal justice system would take care of it and they wouldn't be qualified to be on the ballot again. So
There's been as the media has had, I mean, we've struggled with this since he came down that escalator. And I think that in 2020 and it parts during his administration, there was a pullback in a sense of like, should you be platforming this, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's the case now. I mean, the reason we all know about all this is because it's been heavily covered in the media. I think the problem is like less, is it covered? More, where do people get their media? Do they believe the messenger? And then, yeah, to the third part, do they even care? Which is maybe the most troubling about that. Although I would say the siloization of information has allowed a lot of this.
Yeah.
So subscribe to your paper and donate to public media.
We'll end on
and,
that
and
note.
and IGS.
yeah.
And IGS, and subscribe to IGS. Thank you very much, join me, and thanking our panelists for being here. And we have refreshments in the back. Please join us.